What kind of training protocol do you need to keep growing in the spiritual life? Hi, I'm Mike Mason. This is your Mortal Kombat podcast. The Mortal Kombat podcast is the podcast arm of Very Christie. Very Christie is a Catholic lay apostolate devoted to help men attain the full stature of Christ by growing strong in mind, body, and spirit. If you'd like to learn more about our work, you can check us out online at verychristie.com. All right, gentlemen, this is the Intro to Spiritual Theology, episode 22. We are wrapping up the 5th month of our introduction to spiritual theology. Hope you guys are getting as much out of this podcast and the series as I did putting it together. But it's pretty wild to think we're already at episode 22 and wrapping up that 5th month as we prepare to go into our final month as we reflect upon the nature of the Unitive Way. So that is where we are heading next. In this episode, what I would like to look at is the counterattacks of the enemy. Okay, so what is this? At each phase of the interior life, the enemy of our souls is going to try to get us to fall back into our old ways. Now, these counterattacks of the enemy aren't necessarily going to happen like right at the end of the Illuminative Way. I'm not implying that, though it just made sense in the presentation here to put it at the end. These can happen throughout. They can happen at the end of the Purgative Way, the beginning of the Illuminative Way, and so on and so forth. So, what we're going to look at is some ways in which Satan tries to trip you up and have you backslide. And then we're going to discuss a training protocol on how to avoid that. Okay. So the two main things we're going to look at is a reawakening of capital sins. These are like the big boy sins, think of mortal sins type stuff. Those are going to be reawakened or attempted to be reawakened. And then we're also going to be tempted to fall into lukewarmness. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the capital sins that you'll be tempted to fall into, or what lukewarmness will do to your interior life. So let's just launch in. All right. The reawakening of the capital sins. One thing that you're going to struggle with as you grow in your faith is an inclination to pride. Okay. Beginners or even intermediates in the spiritual life tend to think highly of themselves. They tend to have lots of great plans and projects and spiritual disciplines they're going to do to, grow in their faith. They tend, however, because they're immature and they're beginners, they tend to not carry these around or carry these through very well. They tend to bounce around spiritually. There's not a lot of consistency in a beginner's spiritual life, okay? Because they want to run the show. That's part of this pride. So they're going to come up with their plan, do their thing, but they never carry it out. They're always bouncing around. Maybe they're not attending their home parish consistently, but bouncing around, or they go to different people for confession because they don't want anybody kind of knowing really what they're going through, stuff like that. Beginners can brag about how good they are, how successful they are in the spiritual life. They start thinking very highly of themselves. And then what happens is when they sin, they're like shocked by it. Like, how could I ever fall into sin? This is a very immature way of looking at the spiritual life. Listen, we should not be shocked when we commit mortal sins. Now, we can be sorrowful over them. We should be. We could be contrite over them. We should be. We should repent of them, but we should not be surprised. Guys, in our natural state, we're going to sin, okay? But for the grace of God, so goes I, right? Without God's grace, we're going to commit lots of sins. When we commit sins, we should not become frustrated, lose heart, get annoyed, and quit, okay? What we need to do when we sin is not be surprised by it, but acknowledge it. Lord, this is what I do when I walk away from your grace. I am sorry for the sin. I'm going to learn from it and devote myself to not doing it again in the future. Get to confession, keep moving. All right. The inclination of pride wants to remove all of that. Wants you to think very highly of yourself and then constantly be shocked when you sin, because it's just going to chip away at your humility. So we got to fight that thing. Second thing we have to fight is sensuality. Now, this can emerge. This is with the warm and fuzzies, right? The sensual appetites. This can emerge in lots of ways. It can emerge where a person's constantly trying to seek spiritual highs. Remember, we discussed in the nature of the Purgative Way, sometimes God will give you those warm and fuzzies and those good feelings and kind of some spiritual highs to motivate you. Well, we can fall into the danger. We start chasing those, which is not good. Or we start falling back into natural sensuality. So we can fall into spiritual sensuality or natural. So natural sensuality is when we're chasing around natural pleasures, starting to hang out with those groups of guys that do those sorts of things. Okay. We need to be cautious we don't fall back into that because we're going to be tempted to at this point, and that being tempted to it should not surprise us or catch us off guard. Finally, this sensuality can lead to a spiritual sloth. That's where we get weary. We just don't want to do the spiritual exercise, and we don't want to say our daily prayers, read our Bible, stuff like that. We just can't keep up with it. Okay, so we have to be on the lookout for these things. Now, last thing with the waking the capital sins, ironically, is a spiritual avarice. And I talked about this a little bit when I was discussing the nature of pride. Sometimes what guys will do is they'll start to cram their lives with devotions to make up for it. That's not what we want to do. Guys, what you want to do is you need to identify a handful of devotions and you want to be committed to them. Then you want to focus on fulfilling the duties of your state in life. Okay. So if you're a student, getting to school on time, doing your work right, being a good son, if you have a job, being a good employee, if you're on a sports team, fulfilling your obligations there. You want to focus on fulfilling your obligations fully and as perfectly as you can. And then you want to look at mortification. How do you discipline discipline the flesh so that you can have friendship with God? We don't want to be doing is bouncing around all over the place and just adding in spiritual stuff and being unfocused. Don't want to do that. That is a temptation the devil gets us because it gets us off track. Okay. All right. So that's some of the reawakening of the capital sins that might happen that you might be able to identify. The other thing you got to look out for is lukewarmness. Now, lukewarmness is where you're it's a kind of a spiritual languor where all of the energy, spiritual energy will is like sapped out. A guy who's going through lukewarmness is like horrified by the effort he has to put into the spiritual life. And because he doesn't want to put effort in anymore, he starts to decline. Okay. Lukewarmness will gradually weaken your soul's energy to do things. Okay. And lukewarmness can be more dangerous than committing isolated mortal sins from time to time. And the reason why, if you think about it, it's pretty evident. When we commit isolated mortal sins, this is when you commit a mortal sin, you recognize it as such, you're disgusted by it, you're contrite over it, you confess it, and you get back on track. Well, that sort of attitude, that sort of energy we can work with. Okay, you can continue to grow and make progress. Dude, when you've got lukewarmness, you just you're just blah, blah. When you become blah about spiritual life, you're not putting effort anymore, your conscience becomes dull and unfocused. So now you're starting to commit mortal sins, definitely intentional venial sins and some mortal. It just doesn't, bother you that much. Not good. Okay. A person who's lukewarm, you can't do much with them because there's just nothing there to work with. Jesus said in the book of Revelation that he said, I wish you were either hot or cold, but because you are lukewarm, I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. Not good. Lukewarmness is that lukewarm water ain't good for anything. Cold water and hot water are useful. That tepid water, not at all. Okay. So we want to be on the lookout for the capital sins reemerging, as I discussed, and lukewarmness. Now, how do we fight this thing? Okay, our training protocol, when you're fighting the 7 capital sins, you need to be vigilant. Okay, we need to become vigilant souls, relying on Jesus Christ to repel the temptations as they arise. So when temptations to pride and sensuality and things like that start to emerge, you identify temptation to sin. You need to rely on Christ. You need to ask him for the grace to repel it. You need to rely on him to do it, and you need to repel that sucker. As you do that, it's an opportunity to strengthen yourself in virtue, to build your character, and prepare you for the joys and the trials, because there's more trials ahead, in the unitive way. So you need to start seeing temptations as an opportunity. Being tempted can be frustrating. Trust me, I know. But you got to see it as an opportunity. It's an opportunity to repel those things and grow in virtue. So 7 capital sins: identify temptation, fight it. What's the remedy for lukewarmness? We need to be converted daily. Okay. Every day you got to take up your cross and follow our Lord. One way to stay converted is to go to confession often. At least once a month should be good. It's a good habit to get into. If you commit mortal sin, have to go again, fine, get in there and do it. But habitually, you should be looking for about once a month, or maybe even once every 2 weeks. Okay. But once a month's a good practice to get into. Guys, you need to return to avoid lukewarmness. You got to return to the practice of piety, which means you need to do those daily prayers, examination of conscience, fulfilling God's will in your life day in and day out. Okay. So as you start to do this, it'll keep you from becoming lukewarm. So if you feel a tendency, lukewarmness is setting in, a spiritual sloth is setting in, return to the rule. And this is the final thought I'll leave with you before we sign off. Guys, this is why we have a rule of life. It's the bedrock of your spiritual life. It's what you can return to daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, so that you continue to make progress. Okay. I'll use an analogy of lifting weights, and then we'll sign off for this week. I've been lifting weights for 30 years. Okay. Probably the most important lifts in the last 30 years have been the bad ones, the short ones, the ones where I didn't have much energy, kind of just went through the motions. Why? Listen, anyone can lift weights. Anyone can train when they feel like it. Anybody can do that. And if you only train when you feel like it, you're just not going to be very strong. But in reality, in life, some workouts you don't feel like doing. Heck, I would venture, I like lifting weights, but people think I like lifting weights like it's some pleasurable activity. No, I like I like being fit. I like being strong. I don't always like lifting. Okay. Sometimes it's not fun at all. Sometimes life gets you busy. Sometimes you got to squeeze a workout in. Sometimes you got to just make yourself do the reps because you don't want to. Sometimes you might have to cut a workout short because you got other obligations you have to fulfill. Okay. People who skip the weight room when they don't feel like it, they skip it well, I can't get a whole workout in, so I won't do any. People who do that never get fit because there's an aspect to getting fit. You just got to do it, man. Like you got to be disciplined and just rep it out. Spiritual life's the same way. You will have days where the spiritual life will be smooth sailing. You'll get a lot out of your prayer life. It'll be awesome. And when you have those days, thank God for it. But there's a lot of days, man, you gotta hit those reps. The rule is the reps. So guys, hit those reps, hit them often. As you hit those reps, you will grow in holiness. And those bad days will probably be more important than the good ones when we're looking at the long haul. So, all right, we're butting up against 13 minutes. So I'm gonna sign off there. Fellas, we got 1 month left. Keep praying, keep studying, keep growing in grace and wisdom and virtue. And we'll look at the heights of the spiritual life on this side of heaven that we can reach if we are faithful to God's plan. That's what we'll turn to next month. So anyways, hope you guys have a great week. Talk to you next time. God bless.